Hello everyone, welcome to my presentation. Subject Science, Class 6, Topic Pollination. Outline of the presentation. Before I really take you through my presentation, let us look at the outline of the presentation. Definition. We'll learn about what is meant by pollination. After that, we'll also discuss about the external agents. Next, we'll discuss about the types of pollination. Then we'll also look at the types of self-pollination. And lastly, we'll also look at the types of cross-pollination. These are the outline of my presentation. Keeping in this mind, let us proceed through my presentation. Pollination. Now let us look at what is meant by pollination given in this slide. The transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the same flower or different flower of the same species is known as pollination. For more clarification, let us refer to the image. So pollination out here means the transferring of pollen grain. This is anther. The transferring of pollen grain from anther to the stigma of the same flowers, or the transferring of pollen grain from anther to the stigma of the different flower of the same species. These two flowers are of same species, but they are different flowers, right? So the transferring happen here. Transferring of pollen grain happen here from anther to the stigma of the other flowers. This is known as pollination. Pollen grains are immobile, which means they cannot move from one flower to another. So they cannot reach the stigma by themselves. As a result, an external agent is required for this. External agents are pollinators. Another term for external agent is also known as pollinators. So now we're going to learn about what are the different types of external agents or pollinators that help in transferring pollen grains from one flower to another. Let us look at it. First one is the wind. When pollen grains are blown away by wind from one flower to another or of the same flowers, let us look at image how wind help in transferring pollen grain. This is how wind help in transferring pollen grain. When wind blow, the pollen grain that contained in anther of the flowers blown away by winds and spread out in other flowers, and then pollination take place. This is how wind help in transferring pollen grain. Plants are rooted in the place, they cannot move. Hence, it required wind, an external agent, to carry out the pollen grains from one flower to another. Let us see what is the next external agent. Insects. When the pollen grains is transferred by insects such as bees, butterflies, and ants, etc. This is how bees help in transferring pollen grain from one flowers to another flowers. And this is how butterfly help in transferring pollen grain. Again, the same ideas are reflected below. That is, plants are rooted in a place they cannot move. That's why an external agent, insects, is required to transfer pollen grains. Water. The third external agent is water. When the pollen grain is transferred by water, let us look at the image. This is how water helps in transferring pollen grain from one flower to another. Again, the same ideas are reflected below, that is, plants are rooted in the place they cannot move. Hence, the external agents or pollinators such as water, wind, and insect are required in order to carry out pollen grains from one flower to another. What is next? It's about types of pollination. Now, let us look at what are the different types of pollination. Types of pollination: self-pollination, cross-pollination. Basically, there are two types of pollination that are self-pollination and cross-pollination. These are the two types of pollination. Okay, self-pollination. Now let us learn more detail about the self-pollination. Now let us begin with the definition of self-pollination. What is it, right? So self-pollination here is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant. Let us use the image below. This is an anther, this is a stigma. So the transfer of pollen grain is transferred from anther to the stigma of the same flower. This is of same flower, right? And or another idea says that it is the transfer of pollen grain from anther to stigma of the different flower. These two flowers are different but belong to the same plant. So this is known as self-pollination. Self-pollination means transfer of pollen grain from anther to stigma of the same flower, or transfer of pollen grain from anther to stigma of the different flower of the same plant. This is known as self-pollination. Types of self-pollination. We have learned about the definition of self-pollination. Now let us study the types of self-pollination. First one is orthogamy. Same flower. Let us learn more information using the image. Orthogamy means transferring of pollen grain from anther. This is anther, this is stigma. So transferring of pollen grain from anther to stigma of same flower. This is of same flowers. This is known as orthogamy. Genotogamy. What is it, right? It is the different flowers of same plant. So these flowers are of different, but it belong to same plant. These two flowers are different, right? But they belong to same plant. So the transferring of pollen grain from anther, this is anther and this is a stigma. Anther to the stigma of different flowers but of same plant. They are belong to same plant. This is known as genotogamy. Next is cross-pollination. Now let us study what is meant by cross-pollination. Cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the same kind. So this is stigma, This is an anther. So transferring of pollen grain. Let's say this pollen grain are transferring from anther, from anther to the stigma out here, and they are of same kind. These two flowers are of same species. They belong to same species, and the transfer of pollen grain taken place from one flower to another of the same kind. This is known as cross pollination. Similarly, there are also types of cross pollination. Another name for cross pollination is also known as xenogamy. First types of cross pollination is abiotic agencies. Let's see what is meant by abiotic agencies. Wind, water. This is how water help in transferring pollen grain, and abiotic agencies means when wind and water help in transferring pollen grain from one flower to another. Now let us see what is the next types of cross pollination. Biotic agencies: insects, bats, birds. Okay, biotic agencies means when insects, bats and birds help in transferring pollination. This is known as biotic agencies. Now we know what is meant by pollination, right? Then we also know the types and subtypes of pollination. The types of pollination is cross pollination and self pollination, and under self pollination there are two types of pollination, that is autogamy and geitonogamy, whereas cross pollination consists of abiotic agencies and biotic agencies. We also know the different types of external agents, that is wind, water and insects that help in transferring pollen grain. Overall, we knew that without external agents, the pollination doesn't exist in plant. Thank you so much for watching.